You're tuned in to the MtG Cable cast, where they cover Magic, the Gathering Finance. All right? You don't know about it? You're tuned in right now and get ready to learn some shit. Buckle your seatbelts and light a blunt and get ready for the MtG Cable cast. Starring Reptar and Thirsty, them onion head motherfuckers.
Alrighty, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal cast. And sorry for the delay in recording. I was ill, but in that time, we got a whole bunch of news from Wizards of the Coast that we're not actually going to cover today.
Correct.
Instead, what we're covering is Collecet-A-Cons, something we've kind of touched on before. Now that we've seen a little bit more evolution in Magic events, trying to take a look at some of the other events as well and what the evolution has been there. So with that, let's get it taken away.
So basically, we just got kind of a bunch of questions about what Collecet-A-Con is because we've touched on it, like you mentioned briefly, although we spent a lot of time on TCG-Con prior, during the lockdown coming after it. And while Collecet-A-Con isn't new to the circuit, it seems to kind of have gobbled up a bit of the identity of TCG-Con. So we can start up at the top with, now that you've come back from Collecet-A-Con Chicago, what is Collecet-A-Con, like, on the surface?
So on the surface, Collecet-A-Con advertises itself as what it is, which is kind of just a catch-all event for gaming, collectibles in general, kind of like a pop culture con that specifies in collectibles. So it covers TCGs because obviously, like, Pokemon, One Piece, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh! They're all pieces of pop culture. It covers pops. They're pieces of pop culture. It covers sports. They're pieces of pop culture. It covers toys, DVDs, art, everything.
Okay.
It is also, in my opinion, probably the best event going right now.
All right.
But we can touch on that with the other questions.
Yes. So that's on the surface. One of the things that we like to ascribe to shows as vendors is whether or not they are buy shows or sell shows. So going a little bit deeper with Collecet-A-Con, when you register for that event or a series of Collecet-A-Cons, because they seemingly are monthly up until a point in a year, are you going there to either buy, sell, mix?
So it's kind of a mix. So you know you're going to sell a lot. You curate your inventory based on the first word of the name, collect. Because it is something where, I've been to like 5 or 6 of these now. It's a lot more prevalent to see collectors there than there are players because they don't have side events. There's no tournaments going on usually. It's literally just people coming to hang out, get some signatures, buy some stuff, whatever. But this is the second Collecet-A-Con in a row where we've had a Lotus just walk up to the booth. So obviously that's a little bit of cheating because if a Lotus walks up to a booth, of course you're going to have a good buy.
Yes.
But there's also a decent mix of people that they'll be trading mid-end stuff into higher-end stuff.
Okay.
So you do some buying that way. And then there was actually a surprising amount of sealed at this one. We had a guy come up probably an hour after the door opened. He had a whole case of sealed 151 straight from the manufacturer that he was trying to sell.
And that's the new Pokemon set, or is it new this year?
That was last year. It was like the anniversary set they did of the original 151.
Yeah, okay.
But there was a fair amount of both, but most of the buying was in the mid to low end with obviously Surprise Lotus that just kind of walked up.
Yeah, okay. So that makes sense because when you look at this from a collectible standpoint and you look at some of the collectibles that are there that aren't TCGs, there aren't a lot of dedicated avenues for them. So the trading and the buy sell, just being there is more of like a swap meet makes sense. When you're there as a TCG vendor, what you're talking about is basically like common practice, and it seems like you're there to kind of effectively show out and then wash your inventory.
Exactly.
And I mentioned earlier that these seem to happen like once a month up until maybe November-ish. Then there's a couple month break, and then for the holidays, and they come back. As these do happen every month, they move state to state. Is this the kind of show where having a presence at Collecet-A-Con as an individual vendor makes sense? And I want to define that. When I say an individual vendor, I mean not like Whatnot. They're there all the time. BGS, they're there all the time.
Yeah, is level up. Does it make a sense to go all the time?
Yeah.
It's so your common customer at these events is not going to care. But there are a surprising number of people who are selling on Whatnot or other platforms that do travel from Collecet-A-Con to Collecet-A-Con.
Okay.
For example, this one we had two guys come over from Britain that basically bought us out of all our Neo era Pokemon because that era is exploding overseas right now in Europe. So they were paying full price basically, knowing they could make a profit overseas. And those are the guys that having the presence makes sense, because there were a couple, one was from France that had dealt with us 3 times before. He immediately came to our booth and said, hey, I'm looking for Neo era stuff. I'll pay the same percentage as I always have. I'll take all of it.
Got it.
And that's where I think having that presence makes more sense for a Collecet-A-Con, because it is starting to be one of those events where arbitrage is happening. And I think that that's something that has been so absent from Grand Prix since before the pandemic, that, now seeing that makes me think that, okay, the overall health of the collectibles market is in a much better spot.
Okay.
If that's the case.
Yeah, perfect. I like the word arbitrage there because it kind of dovetails into the next question I have, which is just when you look at the schedule of events for Collecet-A-Con, you notice they're very much centralized to the U.S. Midwest and the U.S. I want to say like Atlantic seaboard, maybe more mid-Atlantic. And so that allows the arbitrage opportunity between effectively those two regions. But the question I have is, do you think schedule impacts the attendance or from both a vendor and an attendee standpoint, or does the location have more to play with this? Because they don't just go back and forth between 2 or 3 locations. They go every month is effectively a new state.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit of both. Okay. And I think one of the important things for Collecet-A-Con is, more than any other event, is kind of pay attention to what else is going on, not just in your game or your vertical, but in collectibles, period. So, for example, the same weekend as Collecet-A-Con Chicago was the Dallas Sports Card Show presents the Chicago Sports Card Show.
Yes. Yeah, I remember that was funny.
So knew that most of the sports stuff was not going to be at Collecet-A-Con. It was going to be at the actual sports show.
Yes.
Similarly, if there was like a big Pokemon or One Piece tournament that weekend, there probably wouldn't have been, that would have eaten into it somewhat.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've really learned, and this is just from talking to people that have been at Collecet-A-Cons, that have sat down across from me or that I've dealt with, is the regional market is so much more impactful at Collecet-A-Cons than any other event I've ever done. And what I mean by that is that most people in Chicago will tell you that Chicago is a collector's market. They're not really flippers. They're not really players. There are some players there, but a lot of times they're mostly there to collect. And what that means is I'm going to curate my inventory for that. It also means that by and large, they're just willing to pay the number. And I think that's something that you really only learn by doing events at these different places and talking to your customers. And in that regard, it's less of having a presence and more of just being personable to learn a little bit and be able to take a little bit of risk when you're doing an event like a Collecet-A-Con in a new area. Yeah. Because Dragon Ball Super may be insane down in Houston, but if you try to bring 3 cases of Dragon Ball Super to Atlanta, nobody may care. They might. But that plays a lot more into it. So it's a lot more broad than tall, I feel like, is how you want to go into these blind.
Okay. And that answers a little bit the next question I had, which was specifically your booth. Was it dedicated to a lot of products? Did you go wide? Or did you try and curate it down to only a smaller number of verticals and IPs and go taller on those? Like you mentioned, sports wasn't a thing because we had a big sports show that weekend down in Houston. So you can cut that loose, right? But you still have a lot of games and other collectibles in front of you that you could bring if you wanted.
Yeah, so we did bring a little bit of sports. We brought a lot of Pokemon, a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh, and a decent amount of One Piece. We were actually kind of light on Magic because, frankly, outside of a few pieces, the game doesn't hold itself to collectibles, really. It's not like people are out here collecting anything except for, old school Abu, early reserve list era stuff for the most part. But a lot of those people, it's such a niche market, they kind of know what they want. The one thing I will say from observations of being at the event and talking to other people is make sure you actually do bring a little bit of everything, because a lot of people will not see a game at your booth and they won't ask if you buy it because
Okay.
they assume you don't sell it. Why would you buy it?
Yeah.
But yeah, and it was the thing that, obviously Pokemon is and has been forever, basically, because the whole premise is collecting them all. The most popular collectible game there. I think there were maybe of the 300 vendors, 2 that had Magic, and it was serialized slabs, and it was maybe 4 or 5 of them.
Okay.
Yu-Gi-Oh was a lot of first ed LOB stuff, not graded, raw.
For
Pokemon
reference, LOB is Legend of Blue Eyes, and that was the first set or one of the first sets?
The first set, yes. Okay. So, again, very collectible.
Yeah.
And I think that, as this event starts to proliferate more and more, hopefully across the whole country, because I do think it's a great event to go to.
Yeah.
You'll start to see more visibility on the collectible markets and more visibility on other games as well. It's the first time I can ever remember being asked by someone, do you have anything from the Monty Python card game from the 90s? Oh, my
God. Yeah.
That was on my bucket list, and I didn't know it until I was asked.
Yeah, right.
Someone wanted to know, do you have any of it? Can I get it?
Yep.
So you never know what you'll run into at these events. But I think overall it's been an interesting way to look at things. It's a completely different vein than what you and I are used to as Magic vendors.
For sure.
More like what you're used to as a Comic-Con vendor or an anime.
100%.
But yeah,
that tidbit of if you don't have it in the case, people won't ask if you buy it or sell it is extremely relevant and rings very true. If you've done Comic-Con shows or anime shows, etc., you don't need to have the uber high end. You can if you want that as your representative pieces, especially if they are known pieces, fan favorite pieces. You could have mid or low end, it doesn't matter. But an amount of visibility for these games is super important, even if you expect to do no business from the case. Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
No.
You have to do.
Exactly. Like we're going to be getting the Final Fantasy Secret Layer soon, and I can almost guarantee you that the more Magic events you go to, the more you will actually start seeing Final Fantasy card game pieces show up in cases alongside the Magic stuff, because that is a cross-brand thing, and they're very easy sells. Cool. How many different Sephiroths do you want? I have them all across all the games. Yeah. And it's going to we're now as Magic turning into a little bit like Pokemon, which is just, what is your favorite? Which one of your favorites do you want? Because I have 8 different ones in the case. Magic being a little different and spreading across that IP rather than like, here's 8 different Chonkachus and like 16 EVs. Pick one. You have that, right? And then something you mentioned, but looking for a little clarity, is if you're going to be there for the first time, would you recommend focusing on 1 or 2 verticals or trying to go short but wide?
If you're going to focus on anything, I would focus on Pokemon, but make sure you bring a little bit for every game you have.
Okay.
And especially because it is a collector's event, this is something where a lot of people were moving stuff from card games or in some cases video games, stuff like that.
Yeah.
That they've been sitting on for ages. They just happened to find the guy because the guy walked in and found them.
Yep. Okay.
And that's something that I think a lot of vendors have learned to not really do at Magic events, is outside of CAF, God love him, who has a designated bullshit budget. There's not a lot of vendors that are like, hey, we have some illiquid stuff. We're going to go ahead and put it in here and see what happens.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the kind of event where you can get away with that.
Yeah. There's a name for the type of bar chart, but I can't think of it because I don't write reports like that, where it's like you have 2 or 3 really tall bars and then they all trail off after that in a downward curve, but they never, your x-axis never disappears. It just stays really low. And so that's what you're looking for when you do these events. You want, like, let's say 2 or 3 verticals to be really high, maybe even Pokemon like twice the next vertical. But if you have after that a little bit of Dragon Ball, a little bit of One Piece, and then you can move into Yu-Gi-Oh, et cetera, in the cases, maybe 2 or 3 games in a singular case, that does more for you on the customer relations side of things and opens up both like wallets and binders for you. So it's super important to think about. And I like that idea rather than going tall. The one year we did Ascend, we didn't bring figuratively illiquid miniatures. We bought like literally illiquid miniatures because it was the entire. We bought bricks, sealed bricks, which is like 2x6s of the tall miniatures boxes for the Marvel games. So they're like, 2 inches by 2 inches by like 8 inches tall, a brick of them. And then at the end, there's like the one large thing. And then we also brought some of the supersized boxes as well, which had like Hulks or something in them. And they weren't figuratively illiquid because we moved them all weekend long. They were just almost literally immovable in a liquid because they just took up so much space. But our show lead was like, this is the event. This is the event where we will just...
It's the one where you're going to do it.
Yeah, we're going to get rid of them all. Pull them from the website because they move too slowly. We'll take the entire inventory with us and we'll come back with maybe one. And we just blew them out. It was awesome. So it ascribes to that. Taking a step back a little bit and looking at the floor on the whole, when you're at a Collecet-A-Con, does the vendor floor contain as wide a product suite as their marketing copy suggests, or do these events really focus more on pop culture stuff, specifically TCGs, CCGs, comics, and pops?
So there was a pretty wide array of stuff there. There were a few like older used toy vendors. There was a guy that had just movie props, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, right.
There was State Farm was there. I don't know why, but they were there. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because there's also like literally there were multiple booths that are just Chimu merchandise marked up 5x, and they did really well. There were a lot of plushies. There was a really wide variety of stuff there. The only thing I didn't see that I was kind of surprised by was there wasn't like an artisan candy spot set up, which it sounds weird to say, but at a lot of the like events like this, there was obviously, I forget the company, they do the refillable mugs where it's like $30 for the weekend.
Yeah, where they have like the wagon and you just fill up your soda at the cask.
Yeah. Like they were there and there were some food vendors, but they were clearly like arranged to be there. But there wasn't anyone, like the only things I would expect to see other than like a, edible dice or something like that was there was no one with dice bags or accessories for tabletops that I saw. Mm-hmm. But other than that, it was a very wide variety.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you look at the Collecet-A-Con website, and we'll throw the link in the show notes, you're just going to see a lot of like game iconography because at this point in time, it's really difficult to go back and try and find, historically speaking, some of these companies that no longer exist in their marketing copy. Kenner still exists, right? But Kenner figures are most likely going to be there, the older ones being traded, same with like Mattel and Galoob, Hasbro, etc. But you can't really throw those icons on there necessarily. So that's kind of why I wanted to talk. This question was basically more tilted towards the icons that you see on the website, which are gaming and then pops, and then like Marvel, of course, DC, versus what you see on the floor. But it seems to be pretty accurate, and then some. You can expect to see all of this. You're not going to see, when you're perusing the vendor floor, much more pop stuff than you would anything else. Okay.
Yeah, and Pops were actually, there were maybe 4 or 5 dedicated Pops booths, which sounds like a lot, but at Gen Con, I feel like there's 10 or 20. Mm-hmm. There was the best thing I saw on site of the whole weekend was a factory sealed terror drone from Gen 1 Turtles when we were kids.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
That was awesome, but he wanted like $1,500 for it. So
yeah, I think the factory sealed and if they're slabbed is the wrong word. They like seal them in
like encapsulated, and those
with the BGS grading as a little plaque. Okay, so these next 2 questions are again still about the floor, and if you didn't have time to walk at any point in time, we might not be able to get the answers. But when I was reading through reviews of previous Collecet-A-Cons to get an idea of what went on, it seemed like there were vendors there with new products. So things like binders were common new products, or larger protective hardware for pops have basically been demoed for the first time at Collecet-A-Con. And I was curious if you saw anything like that at this Collecet-A-Con. Like people there who was like, here's our new cool supply for this vertical. They could
game.
be, yeah.
Yeah, there were some people there. Obviously, there were the slab guards. Those are at every show now.
Mm-hmm.
I think about collectibles. Everyone wants to protect their slabs that are protecting their cards, whatever. There were actually a couple of vendors there that I was surprised by that were selling like top loader binders and PSA and SGC slab binders. And it was similar to an Ultimate Guard.
Yeah.
It was designed to hold 4 PSA, 4 SGC, or CGC was the other one they had. Slabs per page, front and back.
Wow.
And it's like 8 pages in a binder, maybe. It's not a lot, but they looked really cool.
Yeah.
I just don't know how I feel about the practicality behind them. They were selling really well. So
that's what, the more you read through reviews and people seem to run into vendors of new supplies or new hardware, that's kind of what it seems. They're like, it looked really cool, but the practicality on this one's kind of questionable. And if this is the kind of event where you could see that at each one, and that also marks it as being a different kind of event than we've really seen before. Because when you're used to going to CCG or TCG cons for player collection, very rarely do you get this kind of stuff. I think the last time I saw anything like this in person was at the Vegas. We were both in attendance for Hogak Vegas, and there was the booth that had the sealed protectors, like the sealed box protectors.
Yeah, and you expect that at like a Vegas type of event or a Gen Con. You don't expect it to be at every event.
Yes,
and that's seemingly what Collecet-A-Con, I think, for the better is. And of course, Zion was there as well. Mm-hmm. They're another one that I think is going to start showing up at every single event.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question I have is kind of a two-parter. And the first one is relevant to whether or not the service was even available. Was there a grading service on the floor? BGS, PSA, CGC?
So there was, according to their copy, it was PSA grading available.
Okay.
It was a bulk submitter that was taking submissions on site.
Okay.
That's it.
Got it. So if PSA, BGS, CGC, etc. were on-prem, this is the Fallout portion now, would the booth have brought anything with the purpose of slabbing on-prem because it could be a faster process, or possibly have bought anything with the purpose of slabbing? Like, oh, this is a cool piece, or it's, here's an AB piece of power, let's slab it while we're here kind of thing?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And that's going based off experience I've had at the Dallas show. Mm-hmm. Some viewers may not know, BGS is based in Dallas, actually. So when they do on-site grading at BGS at the Dallas Card Show, they literally just drive it to the warehouse 45 minutes away, grade it overnight, and bring it back.
Okay.
And that's where there's a number of people that will bring stuff in. I know at Gen Con, when they've had grading in the past, CAF, for example, has bought stuff and said, you know what, I think this looks pretty clean, let me take it in. Or Preston or someone has said, hey, this is good. I guess I'll try it and see, because worst case, I'm going to spend $100 and find out I 5x my money, or find out I don't.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
That's a gamble worth taking.
That's a really common thing, I think, when those grading services are on site, especially as grading gets more involved in the hobby in general.
Understood. Okay. And then we got a couple questions that are more in depth about the minutia of the show, some of the nitty gritty. So going back to the top level, Collecet-A-Con is a show that you can basically apply for, right? So as an LGS or a vendor, why would you want to go to Collecet-A-Con? And then on addendum to this, would you be going to just kind of wash inventory, or specifically to buy/sell? Like one or the other?
Yeah, if I'm going to this as an LGS, I'm doing it for two reasons. Mm-hmm. One is to get rid of some of the stuff that I've been sitting on, wash my hands of it, so to speak, of illiquid, whatever I've got that, like, I just want to turn it into money at this point. It's a sunk cost, whatever.
It's maybe a Sunday deal with another vendor or something.
Yeah, and then I would be going to buy and sell, and piggybacking on buying and selling, just like what you said. I would be trying to network with other vendors, because there's a lot of regionality now to Magic, to Pokemon, to Yu-Gi-Oh, to LGSs in general. Mm-hmm. There were a number of vendors that were like, they had their One Piece at barely above buy list. Like, well, why is your One Piece so affordable? Like, we can't do anything with it. Nobody shows up. Nobody cares about the game. It's like, man, we'll take it all.
Yeah,
we get 30
Level Up
people.
is an One Piece store, right?
Yeah. Well, it used to be. It's not anymore.
Okay.
But store in St. Louis, there's multiple stores that get 30 to 50 people a week for One Piece. Yeah. And it's just such a good opportunity to say, hey, you know what? I've got this stuff that I like. We don't really move. And if you go to any store and they're like, we don't really do that game, but we'll take a look, they're probably going to give you 40 to 50%. Mm-hmm. But if you're happy with that, whatever. And then you can find a store at one of these things that, you're actually not that far away, but you're willing to give me 60 to 65%. Now I know I can give all of my Yu-Gi-Oh to you. Mm-hmm. You'll give me all of the One Piece that you get. And I think that's one of the most important things about these events for an LGS.
Yeah.
Is that networking aspect that you're not going to get locally. And without the opportunity to have something like this within driving distance.
Okay.
Where, hey, Gen Con I may not be able to make it to network, but I can certainly make it to a Collecet-A-Con that's 4 hours away.
Yeah. And a lot of that goes for vending too. You'll set up your buys and your sells ahead of time for some larger things. You'll try and do your networking there, and the booth is really just an excuse to try and put some liquid stuff on display and move it through, or some of just the low velocity sales stuff, overstock, etc., and then make your presence known and people don't know who you are, or they know who you are and like, I'm gonna go check out the booth and just spend money because you're here, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So like as a vendor, I wouldn't go to everyone. I'd probably make it to like 1 or 2 in region that, like you said, is within an easy driving distance from me. I'm not going up and down the East Coast to go to this thing, but I will go to the one that's like an hour north, and then I'll go down south by about 6 to 8 hours because it's a straight shot, like easy peasy.
Exactly.
All right. Then going back to the IP conversation, which IPs did you choose to focus on specifically, and why? Like the top 2.
Top 2 were Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh was what we picked.
Yep.
Pokemon, because it is just it's
a cash cow.
A what?
Cash cow.
Yeah, it's a cash cow. It's the lowest common denominator. It's going to sell no matter where you go.
Yep.
There's a market for it across the entire age range of who's going to be there. The other one we picked, the reason we went with Yu-Gi-Oh! Over Magic was because, one, with all of the uproar over EDH and everything, Magic has been, until yesterday, we'll cover that later, in kind of an uncertain place. Mm-hmm. And we didn't want to focus on that. So, okay, let's bring Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it's LOB just had its re-release. We have a bunch of anniversary stuff this year because it is Yu-Gi-Oh!'s 25th. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of hype around that. And notably, and this is something that you don't really have to plan for other events, the original voice of Yugi and Seto Kaiba were on site.
Ah, okay.
So we actually got to curate an inventory of stuff that was relevant to those 2 characters, as well as some first ed LOB stuff, and say, hey, we've got the stuff for them to sign if you want it. And tried to make the collectible version of that, because that was, compared to when you try to curate an inventory for a Magic event, for example, if it's a modern event, there's 200 staples in that format that I have to stock, basically, if I want to cover the event. But when it comes to voice actors, sure, they'll, if you've ever watched Yu-Gi-Oh!, they say Dark Magician, I don't even know how many times. But nobody cares about any Dark Magician except the first one from the cartoon.
Yes.
So that's the one we bring. And that makes it a little bit easier to take a small stack, basically, and turn it into a decent amount of money with a very little effort. Because there were a lot of people running around like, do you have do you have a Blue Eyes White Dragon? I want both of them to sign it. And do you have Exodia? I want Yugi to sign it. And stuff like that I think made it a little bit easier. And unfortunately, without a Netflix Magic the Gathering show, we'll never be able to curate Magic for like voice actors or something like that. That makes it a little bit easier rather than having to curate the inventory for 2 decks that don't have the 1 ring and 22 that do. And for some reason, it's still not banned.
Yeah. So for Yu-Gi-Oh! It was very clear what you brought and why. For Pokemon, was there anything you focused on specifically? Like for us, when we go out, we want to pick only a handful of the favorites. So I always pick on Pikachu and Eevee because those are easy sells.
Yeah.
After that, it becomes the big three from base and reprint sets. And then it comes down to EXs and GXs that are like selling well on our website. We don't curate to popularity after that, but we also like if there are different versions of EXs, GXs, Max, VMAXs, etc., and they come in like the rainbow or the gold treatment, etc., we'll bring those instead of just the full arts when it's possible because they look better. And we found that look has more to do with sales at generic events like this than necessarily playability when it comes to a lot of the cards at events like this. So I'm curious, when it came to Pokemon, is that the same kind of thing you guys focused on as well? Or did you have, like, and you don't have to say what it is if it's different, but did you have a different idea of how to pull inventory?
Yeah, so we kind of basically did the same thing where it was like, obviously you're going to bring your evolutions.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to sell. You're going to bring your chews. They're going to sell. Like we had the Ashes Pikachus, the promos sealed.
Yeah.
Those. The other thing that we brought that we were like kind of testing out was the Illustrator rares that they've started. Those sold better than anything in the entire case.
Mm.
I mean, we had like a 3-year-old up looking for them. We had a 40-year-old looking for Illustrator rares because it's basically like you said, kind of the popularity and visual appeal, because that's what people are now building sets out of.
Yeah.
Same deal with the trainers. It's always the gold ones. That's what they want. Or there's the new purple ones.
Yes. Yeah.
That they started coming out with.
Super hard to read. Yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously your gold stars, because it's a collectible event. So your high-end stuff's going to move.
Okay.
And then slabs was actually kind of interesting because we did bring Pokemon slabs. We didn't bring any Pokemon slab over $1,000.
Makes sense.
The odds of someone coming in and just being like, oh, here's a Shadowless Zard, I'll go ahead and buy it.
Yep.
It wasn't enough to merit bringing it, So we didn't bring anything over $1,000. And we actually only brought about, I think, 9 or 10 that were over 500.
Yep. Okay.
The rest were all in the like 100 to 500 range, that really liquid area.
Yes.
And we actually had a guy trade down some larger slabs into those, which I can't recall someone trading down a like piece of power for duels in a decade in Magic. But yeah, and that's kind of what we tried to curate it on was, obviously your big Pokemon that everyone wants, your Zards, your Squirtles, your all that stuff.
Yep.
And then what's visually appealing and popular that people are starting to collect now. And that's kind of what sold well for us as well. And then obviously the Neo stuff that we just happened to bring, because if anyone's in Pokemon in the States, Neo has kind of died down a little bit compared to where it was. So we just brought it to see how it was. And then it turns out the market is going absolutely nutter butters in Europe. So it worked out.
Okay. Next question. Were there any IPs you chose to not bring? Like you mentioned Magic, you mentioned why, you mentioned being light on sports, specifically because of the convention. And the bullet point I had under this was, and this isn't IP related, but maybe it is related to something you didn't bring. We never brought sealed for the newest Pokemon set. Never, ever, 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 ever. Because it always sold better on our websites than it did at the show floor. The only time that ever changed was when the Detective Pikachu movie came out. And I think I might have mentioned this story. The show lead ordered from one of our vendors to the hotel we were going to as much Detective Pikachu as he could, because it wasn't selling on the website, but all the individual pieces of that stuff would be perfect for the event. So we kept a few of them sealed. We put them in the back so people could see them, and we busted the rest and sold all the individual pieces for that. That's the only time that rule ever really changed.
Yeah, and that's the sealed thing is always. I think bringing sealed to events like this is bad, unless it's like, sealed WotC. Because there were a few people that had sealed WotC.
Yeah.
They didn't really bring anything newer. There were some people that had some of the like trainer boxes or stuff like that from the last couple of years. But generally, it's the same thing. Sealed just sells so well on the website, it's hard to justify bringing. Because, sure, we may make $6 or $7 extra at the event, But we could also literally just sell all of the boxes online while we're at the event, and then all of a sudden, oh, if I come back with 3 boxes, I could have sold those.
Yeah.
And it's just not very good. I feel like it's something where I would rather fit in the same amount of space as a sealed Pokemon box. I can fit 600 singles.
Yeah.
And I'd rather have those 600 singles than that sealed Pokemon box at an event like this, because it's also, look, most of the vendors there have access to Pokemon at wholesale. It's not hard. So they're either going to charge too much or too little, and I don't want to compete. I'm just going to put it at what I sell it at on the website and probably sit on it, because there's going to be a booth 20 feet away that doesn't know what they're doing, and it's selling it for $20 less than they can on TCG because their attitude is, why say fees?
Yep, it makes sense. So what about, you mentioned Dragon Ball up top, that Digimon, Lorcana, did you guys just shove on that when it came to the event, say no thank you, and because you didn't think it would sell, or?
So the only one we kind of considered was Lorcana, but ended up not bringing it mostly because of space. And frankly, the game is not as expensive as it was. And it was, okay, do we want to dedicate a case to Lorcana, or do we just want to pick some up and fill the case in? And what actually ended up happening is with Lorcana, Digimon, and Weiss Schwartz, because of the signed cards, which obviously at an event like this can be pretty big.
Yes.
We ended up buying some of those and put them in the case, and then we started purchasing more of those cards as they came in, because it was just something where, hey, if we're going to have a lot of backstock, I personally don't like bringing more than maybe a 500 count of backstock for cases, unless it's, hey, I have 10 Trops out, I've got 2 penny sleeves more in a box. I'm fine with that. But I want everything to be displayed. And when you're only working with, 12, 14 display cases, you've got to count out what you have. And those just missed the cut, which was fine. Because, again, we were able to buy some of them eventually. And that was what opened the floodgates to purchasing more of that, which is why I made the point I did earlier about make sure you bring a little bit of everything, because it actually is helpful.
Yeah, so the strategy there is just, it's not that they wouldn't sell necessarily. It's just that the other games and the other IPs that you could put in the cases would sell better. And when you have somebody in front of you and you're buying from, you can pick up some of the odds and ends like that to just throw in the case, as you mentioned, we talked about before, and further open the opportunity and exposure to those games.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So something I was thinking about when I was reading through player experiences and how this event, how Collecet-A-Cons kind of shake out, the vendors and the experience there, is the idea of the instant collection at booths. And I was curious if this is the kind of show where you could, and I don't mean you specifically as you and the booth you're with, but just you as a vendor while you're there, move instant collections, which is just like a 400, 800, 1,000 count box of just effectively non-repeating bulk or limitedly repeating bulk as an instant collection under a theme. So for Magic, you could do it by color or by guild, by shard, by wedge, commander decks if you wanted to, as instant commander decks. Is this the kind of event where either you saw it happening or you think it could happen, or maybe not?
Yeah, I think this is the event where you could get that to happen. There was actually one event that had $100 EDH decks. And it was basically, in talking to them, hey, what was the idea here? What's in it? And they actually had the full list of the deck.
Oh, okay.
On the back. And it was basically like, hey, we were sitting on all of these cards that weren't moving, all these sun petal groves. I don't know if I can't remember if that's what he said, but like, as an example,
for instance.
And we decided, hey, let's try to do this. People in our store loved it, so we went ahead and brought it. There were some people selling, your one row instant collections. I personally am always very much against those because I think they're really predatory. But to each their own. And yeah, people did sell them and people did buy them. So it's definitely a spot you could do that. I think especially with Pokemon, it was insanely popular for the event.
That is the one that I think, like, you mentioned predatory, and it's just like, God, the Magic stuff is 100% bulk, and you basically know what you're getting into when you buy it. But when you sell somebody who's just collecting Pokemon on look one of those, that's when it feels super predatory, because it's just like, here's a bunch of bulk that doesn't look good, enjoy. But they're so happy to look through all those cards and just be like, oh man, Swinub, like, cool.
It just feels so bad.
Yeah, it feels so weird, like, to see that. But I understand the duality on that one. But the last 2 questions I had, I think we already touched up at top. You mentioned that the average like TCG consumer there was more a collector than a player, because this was an event that was not attached to a convention, not attached to a gaming event like I've experienced in the past. There was one ACEN I worked where there was a YCS that weekend as well, and you had to buy a ticket to each, but we sold a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! To the players going to the YCS, and subsequently also bought a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Walking out of the YCS, that round 5.
After the third round.
Exactly. Like that mentality of like, man, this deck sucks. Oh, okay, so we got that. And you mentioned that you brought not necessarily high-end objects, but more mid-range to the show. So for Pokemon, was there anything on the upper echelon outside of Pokemon that you brought in terms of price, or did you just kind of stick to that mid?
It was mostly in that 1 to 500. There were a couple of the gold stars that we had, like the gold star Latios was, I think, around 7 or 8. But yeah, and I think that, frankly, if you're going to an event that is not dedicated to a specific game, like whatever Grand Prix, Mythic Fests, whatever they're called next year that Star City is hosting, if you're going to a general one, I really do think that's probably the best way to go.
Yeah.
Just in terms of your broad appeal. There were a couple of booths that were specifically high end. And talked to the guys at those booths, how do you do with these things? So no, it's, kind of a crapshoot. It's either hit or miss. It's like, well, how'd you do this weekend? He goes, well, we did 2 sales that like paid for the booth and us, but other than that, like paid for the weekend, but we haven't really made any money.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the dangers at events like this, because while it is a collector's event, it's not geared like the National is for sports cards for your ultra high-end collectors.
Yeah.
It's more your layman, casual, I do this for fun, it's a hobby I enjoy, looking at it less as an investment vehicle and more as like, I like Vinelash, I like Bulbasaur, let's do it.
Yeah, okay.
So,
and that makes sense. And it's kind of what I was getting at, or not getting at, the vibes I got when I was looking at the copy that they have on their own website and kind of reading through player experiences, which is just like, if you're going to this event, you shouldn't expect anything that's just over the top gonzo. Like, you should expect to see a lot of like the mid and maybe even harder to find things to purchase, but you're not going to find, like I said, this over the top stuff. This isn't the event for that. For when it comes to TCGs and CCGs, that's going to be your dedicated events or your Gen Cons, things like that. And even the same thing goes for anime events and just general Comic Cons. Like, yeah, you'll probably catch a Lotus at SDCC because that event is just insane. But like that
there's that many people there, one of them inevitably has one. Yeah.
But that's also not the kind of event where you just want to show up and show out with a booth full of slabs, because it's not going to move. Your average con goer there is like the kind of person who wants to go to Hall H and then come out of that, buy the T'Challa, buy the Wolverine that's at your booth. They don't want a slabs version of it. They just want to put it in the distinct sleeve that says, this is my commander now, and move on with their lives. They're not looking for the ultra high end. So it's also something really interesting to keep in mind when you're looking at this. And something I didn't get a sense of because it was kind of fleeting was, I know they referenced Steve Aoki again as being part of Collecet-A-Con, and this might be something that'll take a little while to figure out. I wonder if any of his collections from TCG Player that went up for sale do any kind of markedly noticeable numbers at these events where he also shows up, where you can just be like, sign my stuff, or like MetaZoo with a card or cards that are dedicated to him when he's there. And like, if those cards actually do more business than you would expect because he's there as a personality, similar to how you mentioned the voice actors for, was it Yugi and Kaiba? Right?
So I think it's, I'll say this, because I've vended one that he was at.
Yep.
People care way more about the Sandstorms signed by Darude.
Yep, that makes sense.
Than they do about anything Aoki.
Okay.
And I say this as someone who has built a Steve Aoki soccer set for every year it was out there. Nobody really cares.
All right.
Unfortunately, he just has not had that same impact.
Got it.
Like when you think of, you and I growing up, like the voices of the Turtles.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
100%.
If I could get Jason's autograph, rest in peace, from Power Rangers, fuck yeah, I'd do that. That was a huge part of my childhood.
Yeah.
And I just don't think Aoki's, like the people who are, you were a big part of their life, are going to Collecet-A-Con.
Yeah.
So it doesn't quite have that same premium there.
Like,
I did get to see a free concert by the Yin Yang Twins, which was pretty sweet.
That's awesome. But like as far as cultural impact goes, like you mentioned, Sandstorm by Darude versus like Aoki. Like there are people like, oh yeah, Aoki's still the new artist. People know him, what he's doing. I believe it's the halftime show at Bama is still just Sandstorm by Darude, and they have a DJ still live spinning it. There's a light show and everything, and if you look it up, it is insane. So every week, 800 million people in that stadium get to experience Sandstorm by Darude, week in, week out, every year until the end of time. So it's still a very relevant piece of pop culture, to bring it full circle.
It is.
All right. Let's kick into picks, and I'd like you to go first because this is something that we don't get to talk about a lot. And while we are recording this, Vegas is going on, which is relevant to the pick overall, and what we will see into the future with the Eternal Weekends coming up and some of the big events that we're going to see around the world.
So something interesting is happening right now, and that's basically what my market call out is. And it's more of a, hey, pay attention to this because this is atypical for this time of year. Obviously, this time of year, stuff starts going down in price because people are selling cards, paying bills, buying gifts, whatever. Just happens. Secondary market like this goes down when people start paying less attention to it because you're not going to tell mom, hey, I went this tropical island on TCG Player for $300 or whatever. The example I am choosing is Tropical Island as an example of this fact. And the trend I'm speaking to is not just the fact that the U.S. market is declining. It's actually that traditionally, the Southeast Asian and European markets have stayed the same. They haven't had to strengthen their buy list to compete in any meaningful way. But what we're seeing is some of the Southeast Asia buy lists are actually increasing their numbers right now. And obviously, Eternal Weekends are upcoming, so that can play a part of it. But they've never had to do this to compete with the U.S. market, ever. They've just stayed kind of steady most years while the U.S. market buy lists kind of decline. And this year, as we can see on Tales of Adventure's hot list, we are starting to see those cards that used to be floated on the 95, on the Haruruya, on those buy lists start to be floated on Tails buy list, which similarly is being arbitraged overseas, hence the higher number. And this is something that's incredibly atypical because, they haven't had to do this ever. And they frankly don't have to do it now because Card Kingdom they're down not as much as they usually are this time of year. They're a little bit stronger, but they're still down below what they were.
Yes.
And while this is going on, I think this is something that bears paying attention to because if this is strictly because of Eternal Weekend coming up in Japan, okay, fine. The prices will decline after that. If the prices stay strong, despite no organized play events coming up for that region, that is a big shift in the market. And that is what I'm calling out as something to pay attention to. Because if those buy lists continue to stay strong, that's huge.
I'm going to interject because I want to see your face when I tell you this. Japan's EW has come and gone.
Oh, that's right.
It had almost no coverage. There are 4 rounds of coverage on Big Magic's YouTube channel, and they are not the top 8. The results are in. It is insanely combo oriented. We saw Storm all over the place, including Ad Nauseam Tendrils, which is a deck that doesn't really exist. There was a Sneak and Show deck in the top 50 that the Discord is basically trying to break apart. And we're seeing people attempt to make sense of a Japanese-style sideboard, which is just shoot in the dark 15 one-ofs. Right? That is... It is coming on. So these buy list prices that we are seeing...
It should be strong right now.
Yes. So everything that you said was applicable like 3 weeks ago when this event happened silently. Or whatever it was. So
but yeah, and this will be something to bear paying attention to because if it continues to hold steady over the next month and a half, 2 months, that is, again, absolutely massive for a region that has no high-end competitive premier level organized play coming. For them to be that bullish on the market is a pretty good sign. Now, granted, Final Fantasy is a huge IP for Japan, getting players from that may have strengthened the market a little bit. I don't really think they care about Marvel, and they sure as fuck don't care about SpongeBob.
But Bikini Atoll's out there. I get it.
All right, you go.
All right. No, I get it. I like it. This is one of those things. I think we talked about this super early on, where like before the heyday of aggregator websites, if you knew where to look, especially when there were more Russian TCGs online, you could track the flow of cards like this around the world ahead of large events, because we had not the Monodrain Open, that was in the U.S. Midwest, the Bazaar of Moxen
Yeah, the Bazaar
series in
of
Europe.
Moxen.
We had a lot of quiet legacy and vintage events in Japan, and so these cards would kind of flow westward across the globe effectively throughout the year,
Yep.
and you can arbitrage if you wanted to travel with these cards around the globe. And so it's interesting to see the APAC region effectively have to fight for this stuff again for the first time in a really long time. And
Very.
also, it'll be interesting to see the why behind this, because Commander is still an up and coming format in Japan. Finally, I
Yep.
don't know if there's a CEDH scene in there, but most of the cards that we're seeing are on this list are CEDH playable, aside from like the Lotus and various other pieces of power. But we were
Yeah.
also seeing, and I think I mentioned this last week maybe, there was a big push for Bazaar of Baghdad from a number of vendors that we know
Yep.
arbitrage around the world. And that is most likely heading into EW. But it is one of those things where if we see buy lists stay high coming out of, I think Prague is the last one in the series, then we're
Yeah.
going to be looking at this kind of new era of prices on reserve lists. More sustainable is the wrong word here, because it is very difficult to buy in, but these
Yeah.
prices are,
Steady.
yes, and they represent like the new floor, barring like a global economic meltdown.
Yeah.
So I like this kind of stuff because it isn't always in your face. It's not always easy to see. When CAF threw up these images in midweek before Vegas, we grabbed them and we put them in the Discord so people could see this, because we're not seeing MTG Mint card come over that much anymore to all these events, and also have Lotus on their buy list anymore like they did a couple of years ago when we were going to Magic Fests and Magic Cons.
Every weekend when Lotus was on every buy list.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah.
And so they were like, Lotus has a real price. Nobody's floating this. This is for real. MTG Min card isn't doing that anymore, or they weren't for a while, and they might have to now because they have to engage with this like increased pressure. So I think this is a great look. Oh, for me, I'm dipping back. Okay. All right.
Go for it.
For me, I'm dipping back into the well of Fallout. I believe this is the last card, although I have to look because I have like the next year's worth of picks set up already. And we are taking a look at Power Fist this week, another piece of equipment that just kind of comes and goes, this little nameless thing that is attached to the IP, yes, but very bland and not something that would get upcycled in a reprint like we talked about with the costume a couple weeks ago. So Power Fist in and of itself is a pretty succinct artifact. It costs a colorless and a green. It's a piece of equipment. And it says whenever a equipped creature has trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. And it has an equip cost of 2. So for 3 colorless and a green, you can play this and equip it immediately. That's fantastic. It gives the creature trample. Cool. If you give it double strike, you double, then you double. It is a fantastic, yeah, right? It's like going in and out. Like you just order the double. Like it's a great. It's difficult to upsell or downsell this because this card just reads fantastically. When I added it to my list in April, CK was buying 172 at $2. They had 8 for sale at $4, and there were 23 LP or better listings on TCG Player for $3.07. As of taking my notes, CK was buying 60 at $2.50. As of recording, they are now buying 71 at $3.70. So this card is on the uptick. And when I was taking my notes, there are 192 listings on TCG Player for a market of $5.20. There are now 165 listings on TCG Player for a market of $5.54. So we are seeing accordingly this card move up in price overall. And in case you're wondering, there's a 60-cent delta between CK's buy list and TCG market right now. So you would be shorting yourself to do this, but we're seeing the gap close pretty quickly on this. The overall, like, what are you doing with this in Commander is, to quote Strong Bad, it's just one beefy arm. That's it. And you're just going to Voltron somebody out. When you look at this in the format overall, we take a look at what's on I'll bring this up as I'm talking. The overall theme of kind of like a go tall, quote unquote, plays across casual and more competitive decks when you look at what's going on. You have things like Dogmeat and the Wise Mothman, which I would consider a little more competitive, just like Skullbriar and Bursley Bill. They're pretty competitive.
Yeah.
Then you have some low end things like Toski and Indoraptor is on this list, and for people that have never seen that card and play or played against it, it is very competitive. It is very, very competitive. And so we kind of see it across the gamut. We've discussed a number of times in the past that this is just fucking fantastic when we see this for a card. And Power Fist plays into these themes extremely well because all these commanders just want to go tall. So up top, we have a wide range of demand for this card because it just sits across like the entire swath of green decks that want to just punch you in the face. Digging in a bit more, we see that like the competitive decks are very tight on what they want to do, and they're already stacking up on their commander. And you take a look at the less competitive side of things, and we see things like Skullbriar, as mentioned, and the most dangerous gamer. And this kind of covers the wide berth of casual commander gameplay and the dedication to like the go tall theme, regardless of whether you're competitive or you're casual, because it's very difficult to go wide with counters and make Power Fist kind of a utility piece. Power Fist is in the top 5 most played utility artifacts when looking at the +1/+1 counters theme on Rec. It's just after the Ozolith, and that allows you to kind of move counters around, so these two work out very, very well. And when you look at that, you're like, oh, you're being a little pedantic here. That's really narrow utility artifacts and +1/+1 counters. Well, that's literally what the card does. So to say it's kind of narrow and pedantic is just saying, like, well, we're not going to look at the theme that this card plays, and we're just going to look at it in the format writ large, and that's not how you need to evaluate this card. You need to evaluate it within the theme that it exists in, because it doesn't really go anywhere else. You need to be stacking counters. So while this card isn't a pillar of the theme yet, because it's in the top 5, it's not in the top like 2 or 3, I believe that is more to do with visibility than playability, and hopefully the release of Fallout on Moto did address that, and that people finally get visibility into the Fallout product and engage with it in a more meaningful way. And then there's also the exposure to the card when it hits stocks as the price continues to rise steadily, and we kind of build demand from there. So we're going to be able to get like that kind of twofold thing. There are, it seems like, fewer and fewer commander content creators existing on Moto, so it's not like we're going to get a lot of that kind of push. This is the kind of card that they need to investigate and see on their own, want to engage with this theme. And we've seen in the past, if you've been engaging with commander content, people already be playing the Wise Mothman, Felix Survive Boots, Dogmeat, Skullbriar, and they've all been very aggressive decks in each one of their pods. So unless you're a dedicated CEDH content creator, kind of like Spike Feeders, it's difficult to imagine that this card really pops up again in that kind of meaningful way, unless people want to go back into the well of playing the Fallout pre-cons as they were. Because, again, all those commanders are very aggressive. The theme can be very aggressive, and it's not great gameplay, and it's not great content when games end in minutes because you literally just power fist your opponents out of the game. All that aside, though, Power Fist inside a Voltron-style deck allows a player to close out a game via combat, but in a way that is a little more fair and a little more fairly agreeable than Craterhoof, because, again, for whatever reason, overrunning your team is just something you can't do. The creature and equipment can both be interacted with. Cheating Power Fist into play does nothing, unlike Craterhoof and its ilk, and you're not closing out the game out of nowhere. Everything is presented in front of you. Your opponents have the opportunity to engage with both pieces meaningfully. It can be controlled with something as simple as a Maze of Ith. So even if you are attempting to remove players from the game via combat damage, it's a very transparent and overt process, and it takes time and multiple spells to get there. And so it's kind of makes like removing people via combat a bit more savory than just kind of doing it with something large and go wide like overrun effects. The timeline on this card is going to be messy because this information was taken before you went to Collecet-A-Con and got sick, and I didn't re-up on this. But when I took my notes a couple of weeks ago, there are 408 copies in view of LP or better. On page 1, Magic Stronghold out of Vancouver, Canada had 23 copies at $6, and that was on page 1, filtered to 50 vendors. And on page 3, Pack Fresh Magic had 16 near mint at about $9.80. So we see that this moves up pretty quickly, and those numbers should pretty much stay the same. It's just the quantities in between are going to change. This does sell about 5 copies a day, so if you just do the raw math on it, that's like 82 days to sell out, which is a hair under 3 months. So we're looking at a card that's going to take a while to just run out of stock, but in the interim, it's going to go from a $5 card to a $10 card pretty quickly.
Yep.
After the first page of sales, which only had 116 copies, which is about 24 days, which is a month, this goes from a $5 card to a $6 card with shipping. To just a base $6 card prior to shipping, and then a $7 card partway through the second page. So if we do the rough math on that, there's about 130 copies by the time we get there, 140 copies, which is still just under a month. So this goes from $5 to $7, again, very quickly. So we're looking at about 2 months for this to move from 5 to 7 and beyond, which allows us to nibble away at supply without arousing suspicion. So again, we can just kind of operate on the edges here in the fog. And then this kind of leads to a decent profit in about 3 months, like I said, based on the math, when we look at flipping this back into TCG Player. The next note I have is about the buy list speed. And I basically called out there is a chance the buy lists do catch up, but based on the shrinking buy quantity that I'd been seeing over time, but steady buy price, this card looks like its demand at the vendor level was kind of dropping, but players have set a threshold for sales. So they were willing to sell copies for the $3.20, and CK didn't have to raise buy quantity or numbers because the velocity on sales to other players was just enough. It was just perfect. So I went on to say I wouldn't expect to be able to exit the buy list unless there's some kind of flash demand from content creators finally being able to play pip cards on Moto, because again, these notes were taken before that release. And I don't think that's happened. I don't think a single content creator has played this card on Moto, and I have not given another look at this card on Rec, but to investigate where it is in the +1/+1 thing, but there are just literally no new commanders for this, so I don't know where this kind of flash demand came in, because it certainly didn't come from Duskmorn and something brand new with that. So any additional demand that we've seen seems to be organic as people are reinvestigating this theme. And now we can kind of expect that if you buy in now, you might actually be able to exit to buy lists meaningfully in about a month, or you can wait to turn these to TCG Player for like an almost 2x in about 2.5 to 3 months. Reprint equity, basically the same thing as everything else we talked about for Fallout. Pip cards were released on Moto, but the license might not extend into a reprint wave, and there are more important or more interesting pieces from Fallout that can be printed well before they start reprints on cards like this. So I really wouldn't expect this to kind of catch any reprint at any point in time in paper. And then we have the buy quantity. I have no copies of the Fisticuffs, but I honestly would like to hold 8. And that would allow me to kind of turn some of these around to my more casual locals and then make profit on the rest in a few months' time. And the reason I haven't picked up any of these is because I've been focusing on building a new commander deck for the first time in a year and a half and picking up the bits and bobs I need for that. Yeah, right? Interestingly enough, I found out that a number of my family members still play Magic and play Commander meaningfully while at a wedding. What a time.
Nice.
And I didn't start that conversation. I did not. So I've been focusing on, I think it's Aragorn the Uniter, the 4-color Aragorn, because I just want to combo out. And so I've been focusing my attention on that and some of the other things that I've been talking about in the podcast Discord in regards to specs. So just openness on this one. I have no copies of Power Fist, but my number to purchase would be 8 when I get around to it. And I'll be happy, as I mentioned, just nibbling away over time. If I could find a vendor that has like 2 or 3 at a reasonable price before shipping. MTG Mint Card still has 4. They're down to $5.50 for their price from wherever they were before. Like, that's kind of the perfect buy-in for me right now. So that's where I would be with this card. This is where This is the current look, and something I've honestly been hoping would have moved this fast a long time ago. Sitting on this for 6 months now has been difficult. Yeah, because people just weren't really, when it came to Fallout, they were looking at the commanders, and they were looking at some of the immediate synergies.
Iconic cards like Death Claws and Power Armors. They weren't looking at the good cards, I feel like.
Yeah, and like, oh, Mothman Mills, how do I make that better? Okay, so we'll put whatever the heck that orb is from Mirrodin. Mesmeric Orb. Okay, we'll put pressure on Mesmeric Orb, finding Mesmeric Orb, and then cloning Mesmeric Orb kind of things. They weren't looking at like, oh, how do I actually kill people with Mothman once I get there? I don't know. Mill them out, figure it out later. Dogmeat's similar. Dogmeat is a Nea commander. I think Power Fist was in the list. I can't remember. But because that list was kind of split into auras and equipment, people have built that deck differently. So when you look at Dogmeat, you don't see this card floating in there because while it is synergistic, it's only synergistic to the putting +1/+1 counters on like that side of the build, not stacking auras and giving Dogmeat pluses with like all that glitters and that side of the package, right? So you've got things like that. And then you look at Indoraptor, which I mentioned, and that is a card index, and it is a commander. But people don't really... Indoraptor is an interesting card. For those that don't know, I'll finally read it. It costs 1, a red, and then a split green-black. So it's a Jund commander. It's a 3/1. It has Bloodthirst X. When this creature enters the battlefield... this creature enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the damage dealt to your opponents this turn. So you want to crack in and then play your Indoraptor afterwards and just make a really big commander. And then Indoraptor has its own keyword called Enrage. Whenever Indoraptor, the perfect hybrid, is dealt damage, choose an opponent at random. Indoraptor deals damage equal to its power to that player unless they sacrifice a non-token creature. So you don't really care about the Enrage mechanic. You're not going to sit here and pip it away with Pyrohamia or Pestilence.
Yeah.
Indoraptor is just meant to punch people out of the game. And for whatever reason, people didn't really start to put Power Fist into that deck as a way to do that, to accrue additional counters and put that on there. There are different ways to do that with other creatures and auras, and it becomes very similar to the next card on the list, Toski, where you're just building up counters on it in a different way. Like a little... You can call it more reliably because it's spell-based, not combat and trigger-based. And so there's a little bit of, not dissonance, not a rub, but just kind of like an identity crisis here where people want to deal with these counters in different ways. And that's perfectly fine, but it kind of pushes Power Fist down and down and down. And as people have the opportunity to play with it more, to experience Power Fist more, to engage with the +1/+1 counter stuff in a more meaningful way, then we see the rise in Power Fist. And I don't think it's ever going to stop. I think we're just going to see the fist rise to the top.
Yeah.
So
I think so.
Right.
I think the card's great. I love that it plays into the +1/+1 counter theme because that's something that Wizards has obviously shown a very deep-seated commitment to, as well as doubling counters, which is another thing that Wizards has shown a deep-seated commitment to doing. And the fact that, obviously being color agnostic helps, but this is something that I imagine if we ever go back to a +1/+1 plane, I know we got our set release, so I won't say anything about that until we do the episode on it, but if there's anything like that, this stands a chance to see another sudden surge.
Yeah.
And like you said, I just don't think it's getting reprinted. Fallout 5 is after Elder Scrolls 6, which the way Bethesda is going is probably 10 years away. So there's no reason for them to reprint this card unless they suddenly do a Universes Within, which doesn't seem likely since they are so committed to Universes Beyond.
And even then, like I said, like this is a piece of equipment that could make it into Commander deck as a Universes Within, but there are also some other opportunities to reprint some more meaningful things in its stead. And so I wouldn't honestly expect to get a reprint of this card in a Commander deck anyway. So the jury's out on that one, but I think even if we do get a meaningful reprint of this card in a Commander deck that just does what we like, which is just bring visibility to the card again. And so now with new demand comes the opportunity to sell out again at a higher, buy in lower and sell out higher. So
exactly,
I like that overall. Anything else before we cut out?
Nope.
All right. So for at MTG Cabalcast on Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube, I am at Halt. I am Reptar. You are
At Damon _Thurston.
All right. See you next week.